What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. Today I'm bringing you my first kind of quick tip video. So this isn't a full-on project, but I felt like it deserved its own video just to kind of explain a technique a little further. So I'm in the midst of working on this DIY plywood couch, and I want to be able to build it without a table saw, because I know a lot of people don't have access to table saws, and I want to basically turn this circular saw into what is essentially a track saw. So you've probably seen this technique in other videos. It's certainly not my original concept, but I figured I was gonna make one anyway. Why not get some footage of it? What you'll need is basically some offcuts of plywood. Most people will have a couple different sized tracks. One that's long enough to cut a full length sheet of plywood vertically. Another one that's kind of shorter, usually in the 50-ish inch range, to cut a sheet of plywood horizontally. And then one that maybe is even shorter, something around the 30-inch range for doing some smaller cross cuts. So what I have here is a scrap of 3/4 inch plywood. This is a full length, 96 inches. It's about 7.5 inches wide. And I've also got an offcut of a piece of 1/4 inch plywood, again, full length, and about 20 inches wide. So I'm not gonna need all of this material. I'm gonna rip both of these down on the table saw, and you might be saying, it's kind of ridiculous to use the table saw to build a project that's trying to make you avoid a table saw, but you can just have your local home center do it for you. They have a panel saw there that is awesome at ripping plywood, so leverage that free skill and get them to make the cuts for you. So what we're gonna need to do is essentially rip this piece of 3/4 inch to around 5 inches, just enough to basically clear the motor here on the saw so that we have room to clamp this down when we're making cuts. And then we're gonna rip this piece of 1/4 inch plywood to be wide enough to have room to glue down this 3/4 inch plywood and have a little bit of overhang so that we can actually cut it flush with the circular saw itself, which is what will create the zero clearance functionality. So let's go ahead and move over to the table saw and make our rip cuts. The exact size of the pieces for your straight edge jig will really depend on the model of circular saw you'll be using, but I think about 5 inches wide for the 3/4 inch piece of plywood and 10 inches wide for the 1/4 inch piece of plywood are a good starting point. After ripping the two pieces to width, the next step was to glue the two pieces together. To hold the pieces together while the glue dried, I added some 3/4 inch brad nails from the bottom of the guide, and then came back and added some 3/4 inch screws. Keeping things perfectly square here doesn't really matter much, just keep the edges of the two pieces aligned as well as you can. It's important to countersink the screws so the heads are below the surface of the plywood. Also make sure to add the screws and nails from the bottom of the guide, since the 1/4 inch plywood doesn't have much depth to create a good hold. After letting the glue dry for about an hour, I came back and trimmed the guide on the miter saw. Again, keeping things square doesn't really matter here, since the only reference surface on this guide is the inside edge of the 3/4 inch plywood. If you don't have a miter saw, you could make this cut with your circular saw and a speed square. I cut each end square and then cut the guide into two pieces, one at roughly 59 inches long and one at roughly 36 inches long. And these are two really useful sizes, since the 59 inch guide is long enough to cross-cut a full sheet of plywood or other sheet goods, and the 36 inch guide is good for shorter cross-cuts. To make this guide work as a zero clearance jig, I needed to trim the 1/4 inch plywood to size. So I set the depth on my circular saw to just go through the plywood, and then ran the saw along the edge of the 3/4 inch plywood. I made the cut on top of some 1-inch foam insulation, and this is a great way to protect whatever surface you're working on. A piece like this only costs around $20 at your local home center and is almost infinitely reusable. Once I made the cut, I just double checked the width at each end to make sure I didn't let the saw move from the fence at any point, and it looked good. And with that confirmed, the guide was done. All right, with that, the circular saw straight edge is pretty much complete. There are a few other things you could add. One would be some sort of fence here that would be at perfectly 90 degrees to the rest of the track, so you could basically just hook it up against the sheet of plywood or whatever kind of sheet good you're ripping, and know you have a nice square reference. On this plywood sofa project, I'm actually gonna be cutting some angles, so I'm not gonna add a fence to mine. Having one of these kind of drywall T-squares is super useful. You can butt that up against the sheet and then butt the guide up against this, and these only cost like $10 or something like that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Nice and simple. The plywood project will be out on Tuesday, so stay tuned for that. If it's already out, I'll add a card in case you're watching this in the future, so you can go see this thing in action. Thanks again for watching, guys. If you don't already, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos every Tuesday. Also have a list of all the tools and materials I used in the video description below. And until next week, happy building, guys.